They said Israel could not survive, not against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, not all at once, and certainly not in 6 days. Yet, in one blinding week of June 1967, a small nation, smaller than the U.S., state of New Jersey crushed 3 Arab armies, seized territory, triple its size, and redrew the map of the Middle East. It wasn't just a military victory. It was a psychological shockwave, one that still echoes in every checkpoint, every border wall, every negotiation, and in every act of war and peace that followed. But how did it happen? How did Israel, fighting alone, surrounded by enemies, not just survive, but dominate? And more haunting still, why did the Arab world, despite its numbers, its rhetoric, and its weapons, fail to stop it? The answer is a story of missed signals, broken alliances, political theater, and surgical precision, with a war plan years in the making and an entire region just one rumor away from catastrophe. This is the story of the 6-Day War. Nearly 2 decades had passed since the first Arab-Israeli War in 1948, a conflict born from the chaos of the British withdrawal from Palestine and the sudden declaration of the State of Israel. That war ended not in peace, but in pausa. By 1967, the armistice lines had calcified into fragile borders that no one truly accepted. Palestinians, still stateless, lived under Egyptian control in Gaza or Jordanian control in the West Bank, holding on to dreams of return, of revolution, of vengeance. To the north, Syria sponsored Palestinian militants, including the upstart Fatah group, using cross-border attacks to pressure Israel and rally pan-Arab sentiment. But the Arab world was deeply divided beneath the surface. Egypt's charismatic president Gamal Abdel Nasser positioned himself as the champion of pan-Arab nationalism. He had humiliated the British and French during the Suez Crisis of 1956 and hoped to unite the Arab world under his vision, but unity, as always, was elusive. Syria had once briefly merged with Egypt to form the United Arab Republic, but after a 1961 coup, the union crumbled. The new Ba'athist regime in Damascus distrusted Nasser and purged his loyalists. Syria and Egypt, though publicly allied, viewed each other through slitted eyes. In Jordan, King Hussein ruled cautiously. A British-educated monarch, Hussein tried to balance loyalty to his Palestinian subjects with his kingdom's survival. He distrusted Nasser and had barely escaped an Egyptian-backed assassination attempt in 1962. What united them, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, was not ideology or strategy, but a shared rejection of Israel, and the border never stayed quiet. Palestinian Fedayeen launched raids. Syrian artillery shelled northern Israeli farms from the heights of the Golan. Israeli reprisals followed swift, punishing, often controversial. One such clash in November 1966 saw Israeli troops strike the West Bank village of Samu after a mine killed Israeli soldiers. Jordan, though not directly responsible, was humiliated. Nasser, again, did nothing, and was mocked by Syria as weak. The embers of conflict were always smoldering. It only took a gust of wind to light the fire. That wind came in the spring of 1967 from Moscow. On May 14th, the Soviet Union delivered a warning to Egypt. Israeli forces were massing on the Syrian border and could strike at any moment. It was false. Israeli troop movements were routine. Intelligence gathered by both Syrian and Egyptian officers confirmed this days later. But the truth didn't matter. The rumor was useful. President Nasser, eager to restore his image and reassert Arab unity, responded with decisive symbolism. He ordered Egyptian troops into the Sinai Peninsula, closer to the Israeli border under the command of his longtime ally and field marshal, Abdelhakim Amer. It was theater, but it was dangerous theater. Egypt demanded the withdrawal of the United Nations Emergency Force peacekeepers stationed in Sinai since 1956. The UN, surprisingly compliant, agreed. On May 19th, the peacekeepers vanished overnight. Within hours, Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol doubled military reserves and sent tanks southward, but the true provocation came on May 21st. Nasser announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran, the narrow sea lane linking Israel to the Red Sea. To Israel, it was more than a threat. It was a casus belli. Tel Aviv mobilized. Trenches were dug. Mass graves were prepared. Families stocked shelters. A siege mentality set in, and still, Nasser believed or hoped that his brinkmanship would not trigger war. He wanted victory by intimidation, not invasion. But words have weight, and Cairo's radios crackled with fire. With the closing of the Gulf of Aqaba, Israel will either be strangled or burned. Meanwhile, Egyptian troops marched through Cairo as crowds chanted for war, for honor, for Palestine. In Israel, the war cabinet weighed its options. Diplomacy bought time, but time was running out. On the 4th of June, after weeks of tension, the Israeli leadership made its choice. A preemptive strike was authorized. 0 hour, 7 a.m. June 6th, 1967. Israeli pilots took off from air bases across the country in near-total radio blackout. The first wave of jets skimmed just meters above the desert, hugging the contours of the land to stay invisible to radar. At 7:45 a.m., over 200 Israeli warplanes, A-4 Skyhawks, Mystère, Mirage 3 swept into Egyptian airspace. Their targets were not enemy planes in the sky, but the airfields themselves. Runways were bombed and cratered first, to trap aircraft on the ground. Then came the hangars, the fuel depots, the command towers. Egyptian pilots barely made it to their cockpits. Some ran across tarmacs as bombs exploded around them. At least one pilot, Hashim Mustafa, later described pulling out his sidearm in desperation to fire at incoming jets. It was a sad comedy. He recalled, pilots of the newest and best equipped jets fighting with handguns. By 9 a.m., the Egyptian Air Force, once considered the backbone of Arab resistance, was gone. Israeli planes then turned their sights north. They struck Syrian air bases with similar ferocity, cratering runways and wiping out squadrons of MiGs before they ever left the ground. In Jordan, King Hussein had been hesitant to join the war, but after being fed false reports from Egypt claiming Egyptian victories, he ordered his British-trained army into action. The result was devastating. Israeli jets targeted Jordanian airfields and command posts. Communications were cut. Ground troops in the West Bank soon found themselves under heavy artillery and armor assault without air cover. In one morning, the skies of the Middle East changed hands. Israeli losses, just 19 aircraft. Arab losses, over 400, with air superiority secured. The second act began. Israeli tanks surged across the desert. To the south, in the Sinai, Israeli armor pushed forward at lightning speed. Rather than get bogged down in urban resistance, Israeli commanders chose to bypass the Gaza Strip entirely. Their target was deeper, the heart of the Egyptian army. Major General Ariel Sharon, a name that would become infamous in later decades, led one of the key thrusts through the Katef defenses. It was a brutal coordinated assault involving tanks, mechanized infantry, and paratroopers dropped in by helicopter to take out artillery positions behind enemy lines. By evening, Egypt's 7th and 20th Divisions had collapsed. Israeli tanks surged westward. There was little to stop them. Field Marshal Amer, the architect of Egypt's deployment, briefed President Nasser with a lie, that all was under control. They feared that Syria or Jordan might withdraw from the conflict if they knew how badly Egypt had already been beaten. So the illusion was maintained while Israeli forces drove deeper. In the north, on the Golan Heights, Syrian commanders attempted a limited offensive, but bridges were too narrow for their outdated T-34 tanks, and Israeli militia repelled the advance with small arms and grit. Meanwhile, in the center of the conflict, the real prize was being encircled: Jerusalem. Part 6. The City of Stone and Fire. Jerusalem had been a city divided since 1948, sliced down the middle by barbed wire and bunkers. West Jerusalem belonged to Israel. East Jerusalem, including the Old City and its sacred sites, was under Jordanian control. At 2 a.m. on June 6th, the battle for the soul of the city began. Israeli mortars and rockets rained down on Jordanian positions. Fighting was fierce, especially around Ammunition Hill, a fortified site critical for access to the city's northeast. Israeli paratroopers faced booby traps, underground bunkers, and hand-to-hand combat in trenches that ran red with blood. The hill was captured by dawn. Dozens died on both sides. But the momentum was clear. Elsewhere, Israeli tanks punched into East Jerusalem. At one point, a column of paratroopers turned down the wrong street and was ambushed. An Israeli survivor recalled the road becoming a slaughterhouse in seconds. Still, they pressed forward street by street, building by building. Israeli aircraft, with skies still under their total control, struck Jordanian reinforcements coming in from the east. King Hussein himself witnessed the aftermath. The roads were clogged with smoking vehicles, men wounded, exhausted, trying to escape as a cloud of Israeli mirages screamed overhead. By the night of the 6th of June, the old city was surrounded. On the morning of the 7th of June, the paratroopers moved in. Colonel Mordecai Mottagur, commanding the 55th Paratroop Brigade, radioed the words that would be etched into Israeli history: "We are now at the gates of the old city. In a little while, we will enter it. The Jewish nation is awaiting our victory." They passed through the Lion's Gate. Soon after, Israeli soldiers stood at the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. Photographs of those moments, young paratroopers weeping, hands on ancient stone, would become iconic. In the eyes of many Israelis, the war had become something more a deliverance. But for Jordan, it was ruin. Its army shattered, its air force destroyed. And the third holiest site in Islam lost the Dome of the Rock, now under Israeli control. While the eyes of the world turned to Jerusalem, the desert war in Sinai reached its breaking point. Egyptian forces, battered from the air and outmaneuvered on the ground, began a general retreat toward the Suez Canal. But it wasn't a retreat, it was a collapse. Israeli tanks, led by Centurion and Patton models, raced ahead to the Gidi and Mitla passes, critical choke points along the route to the canal. There, they lay in wait. What followed was carnage. Egyptian tanks, trucks, and infantry caught in column, with no air cover and no plan, rolled straight into ambushes. Israeli jets struck from above with napalm, cannon, fire, and rockets. On the ground, IDF units moved swiftly, cutting off escape routes. In the chaos, command structures evaporated. Radio communication failed. Units became isolated. Soldiers abandoned positions in panic. Some ran, some fought, some tried to surrender. Eyewitnesses described the scenes as apocalyptic roads littered with twisted vehicles, bodies burned or buried under rubble. In one notorious incident, Israeli troops, unable to handle the volume of Egyptian prisoners of war, released many to walk unarmed across the canal, a surreal procession of defeat. But not all captives were spared. There are credible reports, backed by international investigations, of Israeli soldiers executing Egyptian POWs during the retreat. While denied by Israel at the time, later accounts from both sides would raise disturbing questions that still remain open today. On June 5th, the Egyptian army no longer existed in organized form. Nearly 80% of its armor was lost. Over 10,000 trucks were abandoned or destroyed. Hundreds of tanks were left burning in the sand. Then, a final shock. Israeli planes and torpedo boats attacked the USS Liberty, a U.S. Navy signals intelligence ship stationed off the coast of Egypt. The assault killed 34 American sailors and wounded over 170. Israel claimed mistaken identity. The United States accepted the explanation reluctantly. To this day, some believe the attack was deliberate, intended to prevent American interception of Israeli military transmissions during the Sinai campaign. But proof remains elusive, and the fog of war continues to shield the truth. That same evening, Egyptian President Nasser went on air at 7:43 p.m. His voice filled radios across the Arab world. Egypt, it declared, would accept a UN-brokered ceasefire. He offered his resignation, but the streets of Cairo erupted in protest, not against defeat, but against surrender. Nasser, once again, remained in power. His army, however, was gone. Now, with Jordanian and Egyptian forces shattered, Israel turned north. Syria still held the high ground, the Golan Heights, a rugged plateau fortified with bunkers, minefields, and artillery emplacements. From there, Syrian guns had shelled Israeli farms and kibbutzim for years. But Syrian morale was crumbling. Their army, poorly trained and riddled with political purges, was disorganized. Some units still used German Panzer IV tanks, relics of the Second World War. Their command structure, gutted by internal suspicion, was barely functional. Still, taking the Golan Heights would be costly. On June 9th, Israeli artillery and aircraft began an intense bombardment. Over 1,000 airstrikes hit Syrian positions that morning, but the steep, rocky terrain protected many bunkers. Israeli tanks struggled to advance under fire. It took hours and many casualties for Israeli bulldozers to clear paths through minefields. In the trenches, close quarters fighting erupted. Grenades, bayonets, and flamethrowers were used in terrain more suited to medieval warfare than modern combat. Israeli intelligence, some of it provided by the legendary spy Eli Cohen, who had infiltrated the highest levels of Syrian leadership before being caught and executed, proved crucial in identifying weaknesses in Syria's defenses. The breakthrough came not from destruction, but confusion. On June 6th, Syrian units began to withdraw toward the town of Quneitra. But then, a fatal error. Syrian radio broadcast that Quneitra had already fallen. When it hadn't, panic spread. Entire battalions abandoned positions. Officers fled. Even Syria's front commander, Ahmed al-Mir, reportedly escaped on horseback, leaving behind tanks with their engines still running. Israeli forces arrived to find empty trenches, fuel depots intact, radios humming. They captured Quneitra without a fight. And then at 6 p.m. on the 10th of June, the war was over. Syria accepted a ceasefire. The guns fell silent. The Middle East had changed. In just 6 days, Israel had transformed the strategic map of the region. It had started with a sense of siege, a state surrounded, threatened, on edge. But it ended with Israel tripling its territory from Egypt, the entire Sinai Peninsula, from Jordan, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, from Syria, the Golan Heights. The psychological weight of that transformation was enormous. For Israel, it was euphoric, a David and Goliath story come to life, a biblical homecoming, young soldiers praying at the Western Wall, generals walking freely through Hebron and Nablus, Israeli flags flying from the mountains of Golan. But euphoria cast a long shadow. With victory came occupation. And with occupation, a new chapter of conflict. In the West Bank and Gaza, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians now found themselves living under Israeli military rule. Roads were blocked. Curfews imposed. IDs demanded. And for many, the hope that war would bring independence had turned to ashes. Some 240,000 Palestinians fled to Jordan and elsewhere. The refugee crisis, already immense since 1948, deepened further. In the Golan Heights, dozens of Druze and Muslim villages found themselves suddenly cut off, families separated by a new, silent front line. Some communities never reconnected. In Arab capitals, the shock was total. In Amman, King Hussein struggled to retain legitimacy. He had lost half his kingdom. He had failed to protect Islam's third holiest site. In Cairo, Nasser, once the golden voice of Arab nationalism, had been exposed. His army was gutted. His gamble had failed, but he remained in power, and in his humiliation, a new kind of Arab resolve began to form. Just weeks after the war, Arab leaders met in Khartoum, Sudan. There, they issued the three no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition, no negotiations. The Arab-Israeli conflict had entered a new, hardened phase. Israel had won the war, but its victory was costly. 679 Israeli soldiers were killed. Over 2,000 wounded. For a small country, the human toll was staggering. But Arab losses were exponentially higher. Estimates vary, but Egypt likely lost 11,000 dead and over 5,000 captured. Jordan lost some 6,000 men. Syria lost around 1,000. And among them were hundreds of Palestinian fighters in Gaza and the West Bank, men who had hoped to liberate land, not see it taken. The war also unleashed a darker undercurrent. In several Arab countries, including Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Tunisia, Morocco, and Iraq, Jewish communities were attacked. Synagogues were burned. Jews were jailed, beaten, and, in some cases, killed. Thousands fled their homes, many never to return. Within Israel itself, the debate began almost immediately. What should happen to the territories? Would they be returned in exchange for peace, or held as permanent borders? Some saw the West Bank not as occupied territory, but as ancient Judea and Samaria, a divine inheritance. Others feared the cost of ruling over a hostile population. The unity of the war effort faded fast, replaced by ideological fault lines that still divide Israeli politics today. And then there were the questions left unspoken. The Six-Day War happened against the backdrop of the Cold War. Egypt and Syria were backed by the Soviet Union. Israel had grown increasingly close to the United States. In many ways, the desert had become a proxy battlefield for the world's two nuclear giants. Just before the war, Israel had likely completed its first nuclear device, a secret known only to a few in government. It was never used, never acknowledged, but it hung over every calculation. Would Israel have used it if the war had turned against them? Could the Arab states have coordinated better if their intelligence networks weren't compromised? Would a different Soviet warning or none at all have prevented the war entirely? These questions remain open, but some truths are undeniable. The Six-Day War changed not only the geography of the Middle East, but the psychology. It proved that victory was possible in a modern desert war through preemption, intelligence, and speed, but it also sowed the seeds for cycles of violence and diplomacy that would define the region for generations. The rise of Palestinian resistance movements, the wars of attrition, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the peace with Egypt and the assassination of Sadat, the Intifadas, the Oslo Accords, the Wall, it all traces back to 6 days in June, when the sky fell, the sand burned, and the world changed. In the years since, the Six-Day War has been taught, debated, are glorified, and condemned. To some, it was a miracle. To others, a catastrophe. To historians, it was a turning point, because what seemed like a final resolution was only the beginning of a deeper entanglement. Israel became stronger militarily, diplomatically, but also more vulnerable to moral questions about occupation, rights, and coexistence. The Arab world, humiliated, fractured, would find new ideologies, new champions, new forms of resistance, and the Palestinian people, caught between the promises of Arab nationalism and the reality of Israeli control, would continue to seek a future still denied. The Six-Day War lasted less than a week, but its consequences have lasted a lifetime, and perhaps the most haunting question remains: if peace was possible before the war, why has it remained so elusive ever since?